Today on Geek Shop, Chris and Chetan are talking about inspiration for how they make their comics. So let's take a walk to the Geek Shop. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Geek Shop. Today we are talking about inspiration, or at least sort of where we got our inspiration to make comic books. As always, I'm joined by Chetan.
Hello.
So actually, Chetan gave us this story, or this topic idea. So Chetan, why don't you tell us what you have in mind about today's episode?
No, just talk about why you got into comics, not reading wise, but why you wanted to create, write, draw, and create your own comics. Because it's, cool. Everyone has, hey, I started reading comics, all this and that, but what made you want to draw your own?
So do you want to start with me or do you want to start with you?
Let's go with you.
Okay. So, I mean, my reading of I'm going to start with my reading of comics only because I think it started as a little kid. I think the first comic I ever got into was Gru, way back. But making comics for me started actually much later because my sort of beginning art thing was in animation. So comic books was always sort of an interesting thing. I would get inspired, I would get some drawing out of it, but it was never something I actually ever thought about totally making. I did do some zines in high school, but I didn't really it was sort of like a beginning of a story. But after doing about 2 or 3 zines in high school, I sort of stopped and focused almost exclusively on animation and about sort of creating animation, and ended up becoming my career. And still to this day, I'd say a good chunk of my work is still animation. So animation, and basically what happened was I think I got into storytelling quite a bit when I was in animation, and I got into writing, and I even got into the point when I was I studied communications in university later on, so I could learn how to be a better writer, so I could learn how to communicate but both visually and in the written word.
Now, when you
and then after that, it's
sorry. When you got into animation, were you into comics first, or were you into animation first?
I mean, into making stuff.
Making, or even as a watcher or a viewer or a reader. Did animation?
I probably started animation, like watching animation first, because I wasn't a great reader as a kid. Like I'm dyslexic. So reading was always difficult for me. So the idea that, somebody else was reading the words
yes.
Was better for me. So I think animation sort of won in that direction because I was, because I didn't have to read. I just wasn't a great reader. But then, I think, and I got into comic books and like stuff like Gru and some of the sort of simpler, even the DC and Marvel stuff, there really isn't that much to read. So when I became a little bit more proficient at reading, comic books were sort of my first early step. So really in watching, it really started with animation, but I think that's like by just a tiny hair. And I was pretty much into comic books and toys even, if you want to consider that in sort of the geek culture. But like those 3 things were really neck and neck when I was a kid. Like I can't really remember not having all 3 in my life. But as far as actually when I wanted to be an artist, when I actually got serious, and what I studied in college was animation. So that was the love, and still is sort of my passion to a great deal. And to some degree, I almost consider comic books like I'm just making a storyboard that's for other people to read. That's often what I think about when I'm making a comic book. So I don't really think about and I even think about myself, it's if I was to animate this, where would I go? How would I animate this? And to some degree, I've actually thought about, because I'm doing 4 chapters of Blue Orchid, and I'm thinking after I do it, I might actually just try animating some Blue Orchid stuff. Just maybe a couple of the scenes, just do a couple of animated scenes of Blue Orchid just to see what I could do.
Now, what you just said, what you just said makes a lot of sense, because when I looked at your Blue Orchid, the one issue where there's no dialogue, you could read panel by panel and find out what's going on. So visually it works perfectly, and you could see it transitioning to a live motion or animated animation. And one thing I remember, and this is going back to, how to draw comics Marvel way or anything like that. It's, the whole thing about, able to read a comic without any dialogue and make sure storytelling, people understand everything without reading anything. And I think that's where the animation storyboarding helps, because you have to visually show what's going on.
So animation was definitely like a big part of it, and it is a big part of the way I tell stories. Like, and one of my challenges with Blue Orchid sometimes is, because I want to sell it to an international audience, I try and put as little dialogue as possible. And that's also something you do in animation, is you try and put as little dialogue as possible and instead put everything on the page as like a visual. So the current issue I'm drawing now has a lot of dialogue to what I like, but I remember when I was a kid, I would see some of the Marvel stuff, like particularly the X-Men. Everybody loves X-Men, but to me, often X-Men was, I'd turn the first 2 pages and it would be 2 pages of text.
That's Chris Claremont. He went crazy with the dialogue. And
so to me, it was too much.
It was too much. He went on and on, but okay, for him it worked because it was, he's trying to tell an epic storyline, but yeah, even for me, it was just like, okay, certain pages, it's like, come on, that's a lot of dialogue,
Yeah. But I think actually, like, sort of doing Blue Orchid kind of came a little bit out of, we sort of got back, I kind of got back into doing comic books when I started coming back with you doing TikTok Tom. And I'd had the idea of doing Blue Orchid a while back, but I didn't really know how I would have done it. Like, the idea of doing animated was in my brain, but quite frankly, it's like, I wouldn't need to pass the first story now if I was animating it by myself.
Yeah.
So I had so much story I wanted to tell, so I just sort of, after doing a couple stories on TikTok Tom for you, I kind of got into like, well, why don't I just do this as a comic book? Because then I can actually get through the story that I want to, instead of, spending like, the 4 chapters of Blue Orchid would probably take me like years, many years to complete on my own. Animated. So I figured, let me get the story out. And again, that's why I think about Blue Orchid as more of a storyboard, because maybe someday, if it ever like happened, I would turn it into a movie and just use the comic book as a storyboard. But at this point, it's like, it's a question of just speed. And so I thought, well, I'll put it out as a comic book and see how it goes. And it's worked out fine. I've had to learn a lot about making comic books, because quite frankly, even when I was a kid, like when I was younger in high school, I just did the zines, and that was just basically 8.5 by 11 folded. So I knew that I just had to fold the paper, like the sizes and stuff like that. But now I'm actually having to deal with printers, and as we've shown in past episodes, dealing with Amazon. So the whole printing process is like brand new to me, and I spend my entire life learning animation, so I know how to do stuff for, like, if you want to know how big your drawings have to be for like an IMAX or things like that, I could tell you. But if you're like, how to print a regular flyer or a comic book, like all the specs for that, I have no idea what they are. I just sort of throw it at the wall and hope it sticks most of the time. And then, or have to make changes, or I tend to overdraw everything, and that way I know that if I like, my bleed is going to be okay, because I know I've got enough bleed in all of my drawings to do another comic book in the margins. So, I'm not very good at the technical side of it. Fortunately, I got friends like you to sort of chat me through it, but for the most part, it's, it wasn't what I planned. I never planned to do comic books, to be honest. Like, I never disliked comic books. I've always loved comic books, but I never planned to do them. I always thought animation was the only way, but then I just sort of decided that, again, Blue Orchid, I wanted to get the story out there, and so I figured comic books was the way to do it. And because I sort of had the time to do that recently, and sort of like, and the ability, I thought I'm going to just focus on that. So.
No, it worked. It's perfect. Now, here's a key question. What was the first animated piece you did, or animation drawing, do you remember doing? Or a comic?
I'm trying to think, like, just a drawing, I'd be like a little tiny kid. I always drew my own characters as a kid.
Characters, and, say at a level where you were like, I want to do my own comic or my own animation. When was the first time do you remember trying that?
So the first thing I probably did is I did a film. I did an animated film for a music video for a friend of mine's band. And they didn't ask me to do it. I asked to use their song and do a short film. And I'd actually made it into the festival circuit, which was pretty cool. This is when I was working at the animation studio. So before then, for animation, you're basically doing other people's characters. And
no, but I mean, did you do anything when you were like a teenager or anything like that?
A little bit. I mean, again, I did my own comic books as a teenager, but I didn't do other people's characters or anything like that much. Like, that was one thing that was always sort of weirded me out when I was in like high school, is all the other art kids would draw like pictures of, other characters like Wolverine and Superman and stuff, and I was never into that. I was always into just doing my own characters, and doing my own sort of scenarios, and more cartoony style. So the early zines that I did were all just my own thing entirely. And then
animation-wise, continue.
Animation-wise, I mean, when you're learning animation, you don't really do characters that much. You tend to do like a bouncing ball. And
did you ever do those? As a kid, I remember doing the flip books. With the
I did.
Do like 200 drawings and start flipping it and seeing if it animates, and I remember doing that because watching a documentary on how animation's done, I was like, let me try this.
Yeah, I definitely did flip books. That was a big part of my life as a kid, drawing stuff. And even in the corner of like notebooks and stuff like that, like I would draw stuff like that. So that was pretty much constant in my life. And I probably haven't done a flip book in a long time, but even like as an adult, I've done flip books just for fun.
Now, do you have any of the old ones left? Like, did you keep any of that stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with animation is keeping stuff is like so big. Because even a flip book, like, it's one thing to have like a drawing when you're like an illustrator. It's like, oh, I have this picture of Wolverine I drew when I was like 5 years old, and it's like, okay, like that's just a piece of paper. Whereas like, I got this flip book, and it's just thick flip book and everything like that.
And trust me, I mean, moving around, you tend to throw out a lot of things, and certain things.
I might have some in storage. I've got a storage thing for my stuff back home, and so I might have some of my old flip books back there, but I have very little of that. The other thing too is I was very quickly brought into I knew the rules of animation. I knew that they was drawn bigger because I had a family friend who was an animator.
Oh, perfect. That's what I was about to ask next, saying, how did you know about this information?
Yeah, so I had a family friend who was an animator, and he basically started me on the path. And even when we were really little kids, he drew a whole bunch of like well-known animated stuff, and a lot of it's kind of cheesy, but a lot of it is like really cool stuff. He did everything from like the Care Bears movie to like, I think he worked on Rock and Rule and a bunch of sort of like 70s and 80s cartoons. So, we'd go over to his house and he would like show us how to draw Care Bears, or just how to do it. He did animation for us. So he would do the things where he'd have like a character running from one side to the other and show us how to do it. And he had a camera, like even back in the 80s.
Oh,
and
wow.
So he would like film it. He would film it for us, and we get to see it actually move and everything. So I had a good idea how animation worked really early on.
See, that's perfect.
He was the one that first. Yeah, he was the first one to give me an animation disc, so I could actually, have the pegs and everything like that. So he gave me that early on.
Nice.
Yeah. So I had all that stuff well early on. So I wasn't sort of like, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, well, I didn't really know how animation worked, and I just sort of made it up. But I was like, I knew exactly how animation works.
How old were you at that point?
I've known this person my entire life.
No. When you got when you met him first and was in awe of this, how old were you?
Oh, literally, I don't remember him not drawing animation for us. So I was like,
no. I mean, what age were you at that time? Like, were you a teenager or younger?
No, like a kid. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I have memories of like being like 7 years old.
No, just the reason I ask is it's like any kid, when something you're interested in or have fondness of, someone gives you something. Like, let's say if I was an 8-year-old kid and someone gave me comic drawing paper boards, oh, my eyes would light up and go, wow, this is what they drawn.
Yeah.
So imagine how it motivated you, inspired you.
For sure. And I mean, I would have times. I mean, I think I was really into it as a little kid, and then when I got to be like a teenager for a while, I actually stopped being interested in animation when I was doing my zines. because I was like a troublemaking kid, and so I wanted to write zines and give them away to people, and some of the content in the zines was kind of controversial, so I wanted to have fun with that. So I kind of got out of it, but then once I started when I was in my mid high school time, I sort of got back into animation and focused on that, and that's when he gave me the animation disc. And then that's when he's like, well, here, this is what you have to do. He told me about life drawing, so that's when I started doing life drawing in like high school, because I was like, this is what you need to do to get into animation. And then pretty much after that, like mid high school, by that point, I knew that was all I was going to do, because I was going to work at an animation studio at some point in my life. And then I did. I was lucky enough, I did. And then after I left the animation studio, I sort of went part-time animation, but also got back into doing comic books again, and doing the still thing with like Blue Orchid, and even like got back into sort of doing TikTok Tom again and stuff like that. So it's shifted a little bit, but yeah, that's pretty much it. And then now I'm here, and so a lot of my stuff is sort of animation looking too. I think a lot of my illustrations, because I don't really add that much detail.
And you could see the animation influence even in your coloring. You could see it's more animated style coloring.
Yeah, well, I think of layers. Like I think of celluloid when I'm coloring my stuff.
It shows. Yeah. And I love watching your, when you color your pages and stuff. It's like, wow, this is it. Yeah, you could tell you're using a different process than what I would use.
Yeah, and that's why too. Like even like when I'm talking about like laying out stuff and organizing my pages and how I print them, it's basically like I'm printing a book of animation stills to me. It's not as much about, actually I've done several TikTok Tom stories, and I think there was one I did, it was a one-page thing where he had the ice cream cone and it fell like the panels. Each one of those, I did not draw that as a page. Each square was just an individual square that I drew.
Oh, really?
And then I taped them together. Wow. Yeah, and then I taped them together. So, and that's because I was thinking of it like animation, because I wanted to because I traced the drawings of him so they would be the same. So I actually did it on animation paper, so that would be the same. So his movements were actually drawn like animation, and my size was just the frame, the single square. And then when I did the full body, I just stretched it out a little bit, like went farther into the frame. So really, I drew that thing sort of backwards. So I did one drawing of Tom and then animated him in his different movements and stuff, and then cut it out and then put it all back together.
See, when you sent me the pencil pages, I just thought you drew it on a regular sheet of paper. I did not even notice that.
It's complete, and I think I've heard Seth draws each panel separately, and that's why sometimes when he reprints his stuff, he can do different formats. So the books can be different shapes and sizes, because his squares are all just individual, and he just has to reorganize it.
Oh, I didn't know that about Seth also.
I think it was Seth. I think somebody mentioned that. It was like I saw an interview with him or something. He was talking about how everything's just reorganized. So it's a pretty.
Oh, too bad. Cool thing, too bad. We're not working at the art store. He used to come in every week.
Yeah.
And he was a super nice guy to talk to, and that would be something to ask why he does that. Does that.
Yeah. I think I imagine it has something to do too with just the format he can work with. So.
And you're right.
Doing all stuff in sketchbooks.
And that's it. And you're right. If you need to change format sizes, especially let's say, his work is not traditional comics. So if you're doing like European sizes or other format sizes, you could switch it over and accommodate that, which is perfect because let's say my book, I do it a certain size. And trying to make it fit into certain formats, it's going to be harder. But you and Seth, way you guys do it, that's never thought about that.
But one of the things I was gonna ask you about so as a teenager and I guess in high school and stuff, you were drawing comic books. But did you I guess at a certain point you studied graphic design technically. Did you study graphic design because you thought that's how you could get a job, or did you study graphic design because you thought this is going to help you make better comic books?
No, I studied more illustration.
Okay.
Illustration, and I took a lot of graphic design classes also. No, you know what? Before going to art college, everyone wants to do their comics and work for Marvel or DC and stuff like that. When you get into art college, your mind opens up, but also you come to the realization, okay, you know what? This is how you have to do this. This is how, because, at that time, unless I read magazines, that was the only way I knew how to, what comics were like, what illustration was like, or graphic design. You had, you couldn't, at that time in high school, most people had no interest in any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. They took art class because, I hate to say it, it's easy credit. And that's the only reason they took it. And only one or two people were into doing art, but most of the people I knew at that time, they were more into fine art or other type of art, craft work or pottery or stuff like that. But no one was into comics. So when going to art school, it was interesting because at that time you kind of got open. It was hard trying to decide which direction to go in. Do I do comics? Do I do illustration? Or do I go into this? And comic-wise, I always had interest in it, but then I was just like, can I make a living out of this, type of thinking. Then you start thinking about illustration. Then when you get to art school and they tell you, what, one of the teachers we had in art college, he was very good. He came up and he, amazing illustrator and everything. And actually later on we found out he was a huge comic fan also, which, made me want to talk to this guy even more. And I think I took his classes almost like all 4 years of my college because he was just so inspirational. And one good thing about him was he came out one day and said, talk about even illustration or comics, and you can be the best artist in the world, but if you don't get yourself out there and the right people don't see you, you might not even make it. And sure. The realization came in saying, wow, and so it was so in college wise I was more focused on one area or other area, but my mind was open to anything, and comics I wanted to do. And the sad thing is, I never did any submissions to DC or Marvel. But I do remember one of the... sorry.
I was going to say, I know lots of people who did, and it ended up killing their careers because they get frustrated with the submissions. So
I think that's what scared me. Honestly, I'm just, being honest here. It's like, what? If I get a rejection letter, I'm just going to say, if they say this sucks, or, your anatomy sucks, or your storytelling sucks, it's rejection, really.
Yeah. The other thing I find about submitting for places, because I submitted for studios, and I was lucky enough to work for an animation studio, but like the thing about submitting, I've seen a lot of people who submit and it actually curbs their style. So you see people who will be submitting to work for DC, and they'll look at DC comics that are being produced, and then they'll draw like that because they figure that's the best way to get a job, which it might be. But then all of a sudden, that they're capable of sort of better and different things, but they don't do it because they're like, well, this is the kind of stuff that'll get me work.
See, that's it. And I wasn't one of those type of people where, I didn't want to draw in the house style, especially in the 80s and 90s, Marvel and DC really had a distinctive high style. Prior to the, from 2000s, downward, Marvel and DC had a strict house styles on a lot of their books.
Yeah.
And, my style, even now, doesn't fit that type of work.
Yeah, it's true. And it's funny now because if you were to think about it, you were probably stronger and better off nowadays. Because I think nowadays the sort of different styles do better than the house styles.
Oh, true. But, when we were growing up, there really wasn't, there was the alternative market, but the alternative market was so far away from, Marvel and DC stuff. There were some companies like First Comics, Eclipse Comics doing superheroes and other type of things that I was interested in. But, to this day, I think the thought of getting a rejection letter was probably, reason why I probably didn't, submit anything.
So TikTok Tom for you started in college, right?
Yes, it did. For a second year of college.
Okay, so like, how did that? I mean, obviously, I feel like, I feel like you were doing comic books before, but did you do anything before TikTok, Tom, other than like the one you did for like high school? Did you actually like self-publish anything before TikTok, Tom?
Not self-published or zines. I mean, I did my own comics, one pagers, four pagers, and things like that, and did that. Then for first year of college, met Paul Marhu, and him and a couple of other friends, friends from college that he introduced me to, wanted to do their own comics, which was perfect, and we start talking away and stuff like that. And Paul told me, would you be interested in, helping out on the, submitting some work and helping us out? So I said, oh, perfect, So it was called Cool Box, and I have some copies. I'll put a visual up of the comics. And it was an 8.5 by 11 size book, so it was 11 by 17 folded in half. And
Okay.
we did what? I'm trying to remember. I think we did about 7 issues.
Okay.
And in the 7 issues, it was great. It was like a lot of short stories. We did 4 pagers, and there was maybe 7 or 8 of us on the book.
Okay.
And it was a large format zine, and that was and that really opened it up, because at first year, and this is in the other video, we were talking about, where in college you're afraid to talk about comics, you're afraid to talk about animation was not a touchy subject, but comics was a touchy subject, so you didn't want to really talk about them. As soon as we found out that other people were doing comics or interesting comics, it was like a collective forum, and said, hey, let's create our own books.
Yeah. So did you? I mean, obviously, obviously you did other stories in there, but did TikTok Tom come from that, or how did that sort of become its own entity?
Actually, that's interesting, because we did about, I think it was about 6 or 7 issues. Then one of the issues we did a smaller format, 8.5 by 11, and it was we want to do as a free giveaway, give it away to people to get interest and stuff. So in one of the stories, I did, I think in that book I did 2-page stories. One was just a girl talking away about her life, and the second story I did a TikTok Tom story. And to be honest, if you're going to ask me how I came up with the idea, no clue. I have some drawings in my sketchbook and stuff like that. So it came up with him. Then I remember Ken Gallant and Paul telling me, hey, you should do something more on that character. And that's when the first issue of TikTok Tom came about. And that's when I asked those guys, saying, hey, do you want to help me out with this book? And first issue came out because of that. Otherwise, and I don't know where the ideas came about on who he is and stuff. Bottom line was, he was a guy who just went around blowing things up.
Yeah. I mean, I think the
Simple
simple premise.
concept.
I think the simple premise is the reason why it works.
Yeah, and that was the whole thing about the one pager. He he has one guy where he's just talking away in a story, and at the end he blows him up.
That's awesome.
The art school attitude.
Yeah, that's. I think the rebellious sort of, hey, let's do something that nobody else would do in comic books, and stuff like that comes out.
That's it. But I'm going to mention an interesting point. When I was about talking about submitting stuff to Marvel and DC and having rejection and stuff, we were a bunch of us. I don't know if you were there. We went to, I don't think it was called Fan Expo. It was one of the other conventions downtown Toronto. Big convention, a lot of big name artists and stuff like that. And I remember Marvel and DC had a huge booth there at that time. And everyone brought, Alan Hagen, a really good friend of ours, he brought his work. A couple of other people brought work, and some of my college friends were there. We all brought our artwork. And everyone went up to show, the Marvel submitting editor was there. Everyone went up, showed it to them and stuff like that. And, they go, you go show it. I'm like, no, I'm not showing my work. I'm not showing my work. So I don't know what got me. Finally, I went up to the editor, showed him my work, and this was the first issue of the full size book artwork, and I had photocopies of I had the originals of the pencils. And I remember going up to him, showing it to him, and he's looking for it. And I'm like, wow, he's going to just brutally tell me this sucks. And then he looked at it and he goes, I have to say, your anatomy is, anatomy needs a lot of work. But he goes, one thing I'll tell you, you have amazing storytelling. He goes, your storytelling from page to page, it's perfect. I could tell what's going on. And he goes, I don't care about people drawing anatomy. Anyone could draw anatomy, but storytelling is the key factor. And I was like, cloud nine. And then he goes, I want you to, he gave me a script. He goes, I want you to, here, this is our sample tryout script. Try it and send it in. He gave me his business card. It was a vision story. And so then I went back to the other guys and I'm like, cloud nine, excited, going, wow, the guy really liked my work. He didn't like the anatomy, the style, but he said the storytelling was great.
Yeah. And that's
But on the other hand, when I got the script and everything, a couple of days later, when I got home, everything, called up a couple of friends and said, hey, so I got the script and stuff like that. And the sad thing is I listened to one of my friends and never submitted anything. Because he was telling me, you know what, those scripts suck, and it's not going to get you any work and all this and that, and art school friends, negativity and stuff like that, and it's just like, you know what, I put it aside, never looked at it. I don't even have the script anymore, and I'm thinking I should have just taken a chance, draw it, and send it in.
Yeah, it's funny, when I worked in the animation studios, we would give people tests, and we would hire people based on their tests, and sometimes you're not necessarily looking for the same thing. Like they have enough people that can do their style. Sometimes they are looking for people doing a different style, or they might have hired you to do layouts, and maybe you wouldn't do the finished art, but it's definitely. But I also understand the fear, because you look at those things and you think, what are they going to expect? And rejection is impossibly hard. So I totally get it.
And one thing I will say is, this is again what helped me was years ago reading a lot of these interviews of any artist, any magazine I would find with, let's say, George Perez interview, or John Byrne, or, even at that time, even, Marble House style artists or something, if they do interviews and stuff, I would read them. And every one of those people I read, kept on saying, storytelling, make sure you can visually tell a story. And that's one of the things, and I'm not patting myself on on the back here, but, when I draw my stories, that's the first thing I think about is, a lot of people say, do you write out your story in detail and all this? I go, no, I draw them. I write them as I draw them. And because I want to visually lay out each panel and see if I can figure out. And, you don't, again, like you said, if you look at a lot of my stories, hopefully it flows without any dialogue.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, it's a visual thing, and I tend to read comic books twice, and even TikTok Tom particularly, I read it twice. I read it by looking at the pictures, and then I'll go back through it and read the script. So
and that's the thing, and one thing I do remember, and what you just mentioned, anyone could do a beautiful picture, not anyone, but again, beautiful pictures, good anatomy, I don't mean to slam anyone, but look at the Image comics of the 90s. A lot of it was, nice flashy art, but you take away the dialogue, you have no clue what's going on. And
you know what? There's a place for that in comic books, but then there's, to some degree, particularly in the Image era, there was this whole sort of like, well, if you can't draw, you can't make a comic book, and I'm like, that's not necessarily the case. I think that there is a place for good artists and for people who can draw these amazing illustrations, but there's also a place for somebody who draws a stick man who you're completely captivated with.
That's it. And you know what? And this is one thing that I drove into my head was, focus on storytelling, panel by panel. And to this day, I still think that way. And it worked for me because I mean, okay, my anatomy, my drawing style might not be the greatest, but I try to make sure I could tell a story.
Is that
And
something? Is that something you did in college? Like, if we get back to sort of talking about the first origins of TikTok Tom, like, is that something you learned in college? Is that something that you just picked up on your own? Like, where did you learn that
no, picked
storytelling
up
is
on
important?
picked up on my own. Like I said, I read so many interviews and stuff with artists and creators and stuff like that, and and just even looking at artists I like. I look at I used to look at my comic books. Whatever books I bought, I used to look at them going, okay, this is how this person draws. This is how that person draws. Then years later, this is when I was a teenager. Then years later, I got a hold of how to draw comics the Marvel way, and this was later in life and later in my teens when I got it, and looking at reading that and Stan Lee, that's one of the key things he mentioned. Him and John Buscema mentioned about visually tell the story. And I remember the certain sample pages where we're showing what's happening and stuff like that, and you could and their point of view was perfect because you could tell. I think it was a Silver Surfer page or something like that, and you could tell what was going on in the panels.
Yeah.
You don't need an explanation of what's going on from one panel to even if you had a 6-panel grid, you could tell from top to bottom exactly what happened.
Yeah. And you can make nice art and tell that story, but you also don't have to make nice art. Like, there's a lot of really good artists who don't, the anatomy may not be perfect, but they can tell that story. And that's the thing is, like, I mean, I always consider How to Draw the Marvel Way is a great example, but it's also really good art, so it's sort of intimidating at the same point, because I'd look at that and go, like, I'm not drawing like that, But on the other hand, I totally get what you're saying, where it's like the lesson that they have about storytelling is so important.
Yeah, no, and for me, it was just like, I was one of those kids that went around, and anytime I saw a new, not even new one, but even going to used comic shops or magazine shops, and if I saw something that had an interview with a comic creator, especially artists, I would definitely buy it just to read it, just to see how they do their things, and a lot of times in that they'll show their samples and everything, and I use that as a learning tool. I mean, and like anyone else, I didn't buy a comic just to read it and throw it away on the side afterwards. Some of the comics I looked at, like for example, like early Marvel and DC and their books, and even some of the alternate books, I would look constantly for the artwork and going, wow, how did this person do this? How did they do that? So it's a lot of inspiration through comics.
Yeah. So I think we've covered everything about, like, sort of our inspirations, our early days of comic books. You with having, like, early comic books and getting into illustration. Me with animation and getting into comic books and all that. But I guess today, like, what do you think? What do you think? We'll just talk about this really quickly. What do you think's inspiring people today? Like, you have the advantage of having a couple of kids, and particularly your daughter who's into stuff. What do you think's going to be inspiration for her?
Oh, inspiration for her is just like I see it in her eyes, and when I see her like looking at the books, or even, last week I took her and two of her friends to the bookstore to buy some manga books, and it was funny listening in. They're talking about, three 12-year-old girls talking about, hey, this artwork is amazing. It's like, wow, they're talking about artwork, in the comic, as a parent, I'm proud because it's just like, there you go. That's the, again, the, teenager Chris and teenager me picking up that comic and looking inside of it and going, wow, how did this person draw this? And that's where I see what the younger kid, with my daughter especially, is when she's looking for her books and stuff, and she's not just reading a story, she's looking at the art. Then I see them on my desk here. I'll come around and I see doodles of drawings.
So she's, I mean, obviously you're not going to force her, but you would definitely appreciate that she's showing an interest.
That's it. And I think, again, whether you're reading North American comics, manga, or anything, or watching animation, long as you have inspiration somewhere, that's what you need. And you know what? That's how we grow.
Yep. And do you still have something that inspires you? Anything fresh? Like if I would say in the last month, have you seen anything new that you've been like, that's totally awesome?
Oh, just looking around on, the advantage now is, like for example, I'm going to use Instagram. When you do a, when you populate a search, sometimes it'll show you, AI will recommend other videos and stuff like that. And just been watching recently a lot of people doing marker rendering drawings, and it's just like wow, and even comics, coming across comics from random recommendations, look at this comic or this creator, and seeing comics from one was from I think Norway or Sweden, and another one was from India, and one was from I think somewhere overseas, and it's like, wow, this is great because now the good part is now you have the internet even suggesting ideas for you, and you could see, you could scroll through it and say, hey, wow, this is amazing.
Can you imagine if we were kids and we had the internet?
Oh, like we would be going crazy.
Yeah, it would be nuts. Like I mean, I don't want to sound like the old man, but like kids today, man, they don't know how hard it was that every time you had to wait for Wednesday to get new inspiration.
Yep, every Wednesday.
Instead of just, searching on the internet. And then even then, like, getting inspiration meant you had to sit in a comic book shop and like flip through, like go through the shelves and see sort of what inspired you and what you were looking at.
Oh, forget about comic book shop, the corner shop, because, the younger me, both of us, we didn't know there was comic shops at that time. So we went to the corner store and bugged the hell out of the person who worked there going, when does new books come in?
Yeah. For me, it was bookstores, like the old, not the like big, chapters or anything like that, but there used to be like the local bookstores, and they would have like a lot of like pulp books and stuff like that, and like just like reprints of Mad magazines and
I remember
Archie comics, like the double digest.
I remember the spinner racks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and going in
Squeaky spinner racks.
And I can't remember when the books came in because the comics came in same time as the magazines and all that stuff in the convenience store. So you'd go in there and look around, and you're flipping through everything, going, well, which one's the new book? Which one's the new book?
Yeah, because they would definitely not like take them out, so they would just fill up the space. Left from the stuff you bought last time.
That's it.
Yep.
And I can't remember if it was Wednesdays or whatever, but I remember, going in all the time going, okay, new books should be coming out. And every time I walk by there, go in there and say, any new things? But then later, as years went on and found out there's things called comic book stores, and then you found out Wednesday, and I remember every, first trip, you go, Wednesday morning, you'd go there. But then you find out shipment doesn't come in till 12 or whatever, you'd waste time, hang around the store for a couple of hours talking away.
Yep. And then it even turned into like, I remember a few times at Silver Snail when I was a teenager. I think that's the first time I met Ty Templeton and some of the guys there. And so like, I'd be a kid and I'd be like waiting for the comics to come out, and they would too. And they'd be sitting there with their coffee talking about what they're doing.
Yeah, that was great.
And that's sort of, yeah. So comic book shop, I think almost all comic book shops have some creatives that, you go in on a Wednesday and you're going to find some people who are like making books too. And it's a great way to learn those early lessons. And also make connections with people same age as you. Hopefully they're doing comics or something, and it was great times. Now what you said earlier is nowadays, having the internet, when we were teenagers or in our 20s, we'd be doing comics every week, honestly. Yeah, for sure. I think so. Oh, I'd be posting on social media every week or every day. Yeah, I know. It's funny because they do that. Like, we're in the middle of October, the TikToktober. Make sure to check that out. But I think I think if we had internet back then, by this point, we would have drawing prompts every day. Oh yes, definitely. We would be so heavy into it. Be like, why just October? Why not every day? And so but that's definitely that's cool. I think we can probably wrap up today's episode. I think that was really cool talking. And we'll post some samples and stuff if we can. Anyone? Yeah. Anybody interested? And if anybody has like how they got into comic books, or how they think they got into comic books, even if they're not into it. What comic books inspire them. Let us know in the comments, because we'd love to hear about that.
Oh, definitely. Please let us know. And thank you for watching.
And to the next issue, I guess.
Yes.